Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Proletarian. Now, in recent months, we've looked at watches and other timekeeping devices from the Soviet Union and from Red China. And today I want to take a look at a watch from another communist country, that being East Germany. And of course, if we're talking about East Germany, we're talking about Ruhla. This is a pretty basic, straightforward wristwatch. Most Ruhla wristwatches are. Of course, it features Ruhla's caliber 24 movement. Pretty much everything, every watch that Ruhla made from the early 1960s through the early 1990s used the caliber 24 or a variant thereof. This one dates from the late 1980s. I've had it, I've had it about 2 years now. I bought it as new old stock, and it's still in more or less new condition. Now, the East Germans made these things in incredible numbers. They made them by the millions, and they served not only the needs of the East German people, but they were also exported all over the world, and they gained kind of a mixed reputation. On one hand, they're kind of cheap and nasty looking and not particularly accurate, but on the other hand, they're very rugged and very reliable. Now, to properly understand Ruhla and the watches that they made, you have to have a basic understanding of the history of East Germany and the philosophy of the communist East German government. Now, I am by no means an historian, and I know most of you probably didn't come here for a history lesson, but as we all know, in April 1945, Hitler blows his brains out in the Führer bunker, and the last twisted remnants of the Nazi bubble collapse under the crushing weight of the Soviet army in the East and the Allied armies in the West. And when all of the dust settles and all of the smoke clears, the victors sit down at the table to divvy up the spoils of war. And basically what they did was they simply chopped Germany in half into a Western and an Eastern sector. And the Western half of Germany was to be administered by various different Allied powers, and the eastern part of the country fell under the control of the Soviets. And ultimately, a communist government was formed in East Berlin, which embarked on a Marxist utopian experiment which lasted through sheer force of will for 50 years, well, almost 50 years, despite the fact that it was anything but a utopia. Now, one of the peculiarities of the hierarchy of the East German government was not only were they very fervent communists, but they were also very proudly German. And they wanted to make a show, they wanted to demonstrate to the world that they could be completely self-sufficient, not requiring of any help from anyone else, even their communist allies in Russia and China. And they set forth a set of rules, one of which was that all consumer products had to be manufactured inside East Germany. Not only did they have to be manufactured inside East Germany, but they had to be manufactured of East German raw materials. Now, there was a problem with this philosophy. Well, there were several problems with this philosophy, but the main problem with this philosophy, particularly as it relates to the watch industry, is that unlike the Soviet Union and unlike Red China, which are these enormous, vast land masses, East Germany was, even half of Germany, was still a fairly large country, but it was nothing like the Soviet Union or Red China. And it didn't have anywhere near the natural resources, and particularly as it relates to the watch industry, there were no significant deposits of rubies or sapphires from which to make jeweled bearings for watches. And as a result, although the Germans did manage to build a very successful watch industry, every watch that they made was, by necessity, of pin pallet construction, which is generally considered to be not the very best sort of watch movement. The watches that they made are made almost entirely of steel and brass and plastic and a little bit of paint. But they made it work. They made it work for, I guess, about 30 years, the watch industry. And the watches that came out of East Germany are pretty interesting. So why don't we turn the camera around now onto the tabletop and take a closer look at this interesting watch. All right, everyone, so here is our little Ruhla wristwatch. I do not have a model number for this one. As I stated earlier, I believe this one was made in the late 1980s or early 1990s. I did buy it new old stock from an eBay seller in Greece. So as you can see, it's in more or less brand new condition despite its age. This is definitely an export model. First of all, I did buy it from Greece. Second of all, it's marked in English, made in the GDR, as opposed to being marked in German, made in the DDR. So this is definitely one of the ones which was made for export, but it's very, very typical of your average Ruhla wristwatch. It's mounted on sort of a cheap and flimsy NATO strap, which is what it came on, and we're just going to go ahead and take that off for the time being to make it easier to do the rest of this review. And we'll just set that off to the side. So first of all, we'll get the dimensions out of the way here. The watch is perfectly round, and it is just about 40 millimeters in diameter. So it's not big, it's not small, it's just about the perfect size. It has lugs, which are very weird. The lug width, well, it doesn't have traditional lugs, but the lug width is about 17.5 millimeters. And I thought, well, that can't be right. And then I checked the NATO strap, and the NATO strap is about 17.5 millimeters. So I don't know where you get a 17.5 millimeter strap. I haven't really looked for one, but I don't think they're going to be super easy to find. And it sits about 13 millimeters off the wrist, so not particularly tall. The watch does wear relatively nicely. It has some wrist presence. It doesn't sit too high off the wrist, but this sort of bubble case back does make it sit a bit proud of your skin. And of course, the NATO strap doesn't help because you've got a piece of nylon strapping going, well, actually two pieces of nylon strapping going across the case back there. So it does sit up a little bit higher than you might like. And as I've already said, this is a fairly basic Ruhla watch. It of course features Ruhla's caliber 24 pin lever movement. Now, the caliber 24 was developed in the early 1960s, and it was first produced in 1963. As I've already stated, the caliber 24 is a basic manual wind mechanical movement, no jeweled bearings once again, and it features a pin pallet or pin lever escapement. And the design of the movement really reflects that East German government insistence that all production materials be sourced from within the DDR. It is essentially a very similar movement to that found in cheap mechanical alarm clocks and kitchen timers. Now, by no means were the East Germans alone in producing pin pallet or pin lever movements without any jewels. There were a lot of watches made here in the United States that were of pin pallet construction, and they were also made in France and the UK, and even Switzerland made cheap pin pallet movements. And they were really the sort of watches, and the Ruhla was no exception, these were the sort of watches that back in the day when everybody still wore a wristwatch, you would buy on the counter in a drugstore or a variety store. They were meant to be cheap and relatively reliable timekeeping devices. Unlike many other pin lever movements, however, the caliber 24 is designed to be disassembled for service and repair. And really, despite its rather poor reputation, the caliber 24 is actually quite robust. It's quite reliable. It's not particularly accurate, however, and it wasn't really designed to be. I think the accuracy standard that the East Germans set forth, or that Ruhla set forth for the caliber 24, was like plus or minus 2 minutes per day, which is really, really bad by modern standards. However, if you were living in East Germany and you were taking the bus or the train to work every day, you would have just had to make that part of your ritual. When you take the watch off to wind it, make sure you do it at the bus station or the train station where there was a clock on the wall. So you're going to wind the watch every day and set it every day. And, plus or minus 2 minutes of accuracy, as long as you knew how your watch was running, was livable. It would keep you on time with where you needed to go. An interesting thing is they did use a computer to time the watches, apparently. And you can see here on the case back, electronically timed. So I guess if you couldn't have an electronic watch, the next best thing was to have an electronically timed watch. But with an accuracy rating of plus or minus 2 minutes per day, I don't know how useful that computer timing was. It does feature a stainless steel back, although the rest of the case is brass. The crystal is, of course, plastic. I'm not sure it's even acrylic. I'm not sure this isn't some kind of cheap, clear styrene. It seems a little tacky even for plastic. The dial is just painted with painted indices, painted markings. One thing that's rather bothersome about this particular watch, you'll be able to see here, if the camera focuses, there's a bit of fuzz on the inside of the dial. I've looked at that through a jeweler's loop, and I suspect it's a piece of plastic that was shaved off of the crystal when the crystal was pressed into the case. Come on, focus. There we go. And unfortunately, I can't get that out of there. If you look at the back of the watch, the case back is much smaller in diameter. Well, maybe not much smaller, but it is smaller in diameter than the dial. You can access the movement through the case back, but the only way to get to the dial is to remove the crystal. And I don't know where I would get a replacement crystal or how I would get this crystal out, so I'm just going to have to live with that little bit of fuzz. It pretty much lives right there. In the wintertime, when things dry out and everything gets statically charged, it has a tendency to move around inside there, but it doesn't seem to be affecting the movement at all. It's bothersome, but I'm just going to have to live with it. So I guess that's pretty much all I have to say about the watch. I've probably talked longer than most of you would have liked in the first place. So let's go ahead and wrap this review up. So Ruhla wristwatches are still available today. You can still find them in new old stock condition. They were popular. They sold in large numbers, but they didn't have a really good reputation, and they haven't really appreciated in value very much. You can find vintage watches like this one. I think I paid about 40 bucks for this, for not a whole lot of money anyway. And they're kind of an interesting curiosity. If I were a budding enthusiast in mechanical watches, this is not the watch I would choose as my first mechanical wristwatch. I wouldn't recommend it to somebody else for their first mechanical wristwatch. It would have served the needs of somebody who was living under the restrictions of East Germany, where you had basically no choice but to use this as your daily wear wristwatch. But today, I don't see this as much of anything but a novelty. I don't think I've ever worn this longer than maybe to go out to dinner or go to a picnic or something like that. It's an interesting conversation piece. If you're going to go mingle with other watch people, it can be a fun watch to wear, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it as an only watch. Probably you could make do with it, but there are so many better options today, particularly brand new ones from companies like Seiko and Orient and Citizen. You can get relatively inexpensive mechanical watches that will serve you much better than this possibly could ever hope to do. But anyway, it's a pretty cool watch. I'm not getting rid of mine, and I'll wear it on occasion, but for the most part it sits on my dresser top. So hopefully someone out there has found this video to be interesting. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel. It goes a long way to help keep me here on the tube. If you're already a subscriber, like, share, tell your friends. You guys know the drill. All those things go a long way to help me out. Click the little bell icon down below if you're already a subscriber. That will allow you to receive notifications when I post new content to the channel. And the next time I do post a video to the channel, I hope to see each of you here then. Later, guys.